They say the Texas sun shows no mercy, but men are worse, far worse. For 17-year-old Abigail Finch, that wasn't a saying. It was a truth burned into her soul with a branding iron of pure betrayal. It was the truth she learned the day her own father-in-law, the man who was supposed to protect her after her husband died, looked her dead in the eye and sold her. He didn't sell her for a bag of silver or a deed to new land. The price for her life, for her future, for her very soul, was a single, gleaming Spencer rifle, a piece of polished wood and steel. She was traded to a Comanche warrior, a man whose people she'd been taught to fear more than drought, more than starvation, more than death itself. She expected to be put in chains. She expected a life of unspeakable brutality and servitude. She expected to die under that merciless Texas sun, forgotten and alone. But what he offered her instead was a promise whispered in a language she couldn't possibly understand, yet a promise she felt in the deepest corner of her shattered heart. It was a promise of something more powerful, more dangerous, and more beautiful than the wild frontier itself. A promise that would change everything she thought she knew about love, hate, and survival. And it all started on a day that began just like any other. The dust of the Llano Estacado had a taste. It was gritty, it was relentless, and it coated the back of your throat as a constant reminder that you were living in God's forsaken wasteland. For Abigail Finch, it was the taste of pure despair. It had been 2 long years since her pa had chased a fool's dream of cattle and fortune, dragging their family from the green, rolling hills of Missouri to this sun-scorched scrap of West Texas. They hadn't found fortune. They'd found drought, they'd found debt, and they'd found death. Her husband Thomas, barely a man himself, had been taken by a fever 6 months ago. That left Abigail a widow at 17, a burden bound to the grim, silent charity of his father, Silas Finch. Silas was a hard man. His heart was as barren and cracked as the land he desperately tried to tame. His eyes, the color of faded denim, never held any warmth. They just held a permanent, calculating squint, as if he was always measuring the world and finding it wanting. He didn't look at Abigail and see a grieving daughter. He saw another mouth to feed, another weight dragging him down. The day her world ended began with a beautiful lie. The sun rose in a spectacular blaze of orange and pink, painting a masterpiece across a sky that lorded over a land that offered no beauty at all. Abigail was outside, scrubbing the rough-spun clothes in a bucket of murky brown water, her knuckles raw and bleeding. Her back ached, her stomach growled, but this was her life now. A repeating cycle of thankless, grueling chores under the watchful, resentful eyes of Silas Finch. That's when she saw the riders. They weren't soldiers, and they weren't cowboys. They crested the dusty rise like phantoms, their forms shimmering in the morning heat. They were Comanche, fear cold and sharp as a shard of ice, lanced through the tiny settlement of adobe walls and sod-roofed hovels. You could feel it, like a change in the air pressure. Doors slammed shut. Men scrambled for their single-shot, muzzle-loading rifles, their hands clumsy with panic. It was the moment every settler dreaded, the nightmare they whispered about around their campfires. But Silas Finch didn't move. He stood on the porch of his pitiful house, his face a mask of grim, unreadable resolve. He just stood there and waited. What in God's name was he thinking? Every man was supposed to grab his rifle and prepare to defend his home, but Silas just stood there, waiting for them, as if he were expecting a guest for dinner. The world seemed to go silent, the only sound the pounding of Abigail's own heart in her ears. There were 5 of them. They rode with an easy, fluid grace that seemed to mock the clumsy, desperate efforts of the white settlers to conquer this land. Their bodies were lean and powerful, their skin the color of burnished copper. The warrior who led them was different. He was younger than the others, maybe 25, with a strong jaw and eyes so dark they seemed to swallow the light. A single perfect eagle feather was tied in his long black hair. He carried himself with an unnerving stillness, an aura of absolute authority that needed no announcement. His name was Tav-Weta, which in his tongue meant the sun. But the white men in their fear and their ignorance had another name for him. They called him Iron Sun. Abigail watched from the grimy window of the cabin, her body frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She saw Silas gesture to them, his movements stiff, almost formal. One of the other settlers, a nervous, twitchy man named Caleb Reed, ran over and tried to pull Silas back inside. "Are you mad, Finch?" Caleb hissed, his eyes wide with terror. "Bolt the door, for God's sake!" Silas just shook him off, his voice cold and steady. "Hold your tongue, Caleb. This is business." Business? What business could he possibly have with a Comanche war party? The horrifying answer became clear in a matter of seconds. Taveta, the leader, dismounted. His movements were fluid and precise, like a panther. He didn't speak English, and Silas didn't speak the Numunu tongue. The entire transaction was conducted in a broken mix of Spanish and stark, simple gestures. Taveta's dark gaze swept over the meager Finch homestead, dismissing the scrawny chickens and the half-starved cow with a look of utter disdain. Then one of his warriors unslung a rifle from his horse. But it wasn't just any rifle. Abigail knew what it was from the hushed, reverent way the men in the settlement talked about it. It was a Spencer repeating rifle, a weapon of almost mythical power on the frontier. It could fire 7 shots as fast as you could pull the lever and squeeze the trigger. To a man like Silas, constantly terrified of raids, desperate for any advantage, it was a treasure beyond price. It was the Holy Grail, and the look in his eyes. Abigail saw it from the window, and it made her blood run cold. His dull, faded denim eyes lit up with a raw, covetous fire she had never seen before. It was pure, naked greed. Taveta saw that look. Of course he did. A slow, deliberate negotiation began, a silent pantomime of value and desire. Silas, his face slick with sweat, offered everything he had. His last 2 barrels of flour, his only remaining horse. He even offered the deed to his worthless, drought-stricken plot of land. Taveta refused each offer with a simple, almost contemptuous shake of his head. His dark eyes scanned the property again, and then they settled on the window. They settled on Abigail. He pointed, a single lean finger aimed directly at her. The air rushed out of Abigail's lungs. The world tilted, the dusty yard blurring at the edges. She saw Silas hesitate. Just for a second, a flicker of something, was it shame? Crossed his face. But it was fleeting. It was instantly extinguished by the blinding gleam of that polished Spencer rifle. Caleb Reed gasped, his voice a strangled whisper. "Silas? No. For the love of God, man, you can't. That's your son's wife." But he could, and he did. Silas Finch looked from the magnificent weapon, the symbol of power and security he craved, back to the terrified face of his son's widow. He didn't see a girl he'd sworn to protect. He didn't see family. He saw a bargaining chip. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. And in that moment, Abigail's world didn't just change. It shattered into a million pieces. She didn't scream. The sound was a hard knot of pure, undiluted horror trapped in her throat. The cabin door creaked open, and Silas himself came for her. His fingers dug into her arm like talons, and he dragged her from the house. He wouldn't look at her. He couldn't meet her eyes. He shoved her forward out into the dust, his final words to her not even meant for her ears, but for the horrified faces of his neighbors who were now peering from their windows. "It's for the good of us all," he muttered. "For protection." Protection! He was selling her for protection. Taveta handed the Spencer rifle to a stunned Silas, whose hands caressed it like a holy relic. In return, one of the Comanche warriors, a man with the impassive face of a hawk, took Abigail's arm. Her mind was a whirlwind of denial. This wasn't real. It was a nightmare, a fever dream. She would wake up any second now on her thin straw mattress, the sun just beginning to rise. But the grip on her arm was real. The acrid smell of horse and sweat and dust was real. The triumphant, sickening glint in her father-in-law's eye as he clutched his new rifle was real. It was all horribly, irreversibly real. She was lifted onto the back of a horse, seated in front of the warrior who had seized her. She dared to take one last look back at the life she was leaving. Silas had already turned his back on her. He was inspecting the rifle's mechanism, his shoulders hunched with a grotesque kind of reverence. The ultimate betrayal. The other settlers just stared. their faces a useless mixture of pity and fear. But no one moved. No one spoke a word. They were paralyzed, not just by the Comanche, but by the sheer audacity of the act, paralyzed by their own powerlessness. As the Comanche turned their horses to leave, Taveta rode close. He looked directly at her, and for the first time, his expression was not one of stoic command. There was something else in his dark, unreadable eyes. He spoke, his voice low and resonant. The words were alien to her ears, a string of soft consonants and vowels that meant nothing. But the tone was not harsh. It was not the sound of a master claiming his property. It was something else entirely. She didn't know it then, couldn't have possibly known, but what he said was, "You will not be a slave." All she knew was the dust rising from the horse's hooves, blotting out the sight of the only home she had, as miserable as it was. All she knew was the crushing, suffocating weight of being traded like livestock, her life bartered for a piece of wood and steel, chained not by iron, but by a transaction that had stripped her of her very humanity. She was property now, heading into a world she could not comprehend, under the ownership of a man they called Iron Sun. And as the real sun began to set, bleeding across the vast, indifferent sky, it felt like she was watching the end of the world. Her world. The journey was a blur of sun-scorched earth and suffocating fear. Abigail rode stiffly, her body aching, her mind blessedly numb with shock. The warrior she sat with, a man named Chayton, whose name meant falcon, was a wall of silent, unyielding muscle. He ignored her completely, his gaze fixed on the endless, shimmering horizon. It was as if she wasn't even there. They rode for what felt like an eternity. The landscape shifted slowly from the dusty, flat plains to rolling hills dotted with scrub oak and mesquite. The world of the white man, with its straight lines and its fences and its desperate ambitions, dissolved behind them. It was replaced by an untamed wilderness that felt both terrifying and, in a strange way, incredibly pure. Abigail had been raised on the stories of Comanche brutality, tales told in hushed, fearful whispers around the campfire. She expected cruelty. She braced herself for it. She expected to be beaten, to be starved, to be violated. But the cruelty she braced for never came. On the first evening, they made camp in a hidden arroyo. The moment they stopped, she was untied. One of the warriors handed her a piece of dried venison and a waterskin. She watched, her heart pounding, as Tveta, the leader, drank from his own waterskin, but only after he had watched to ensure she had drunk from hers first. It was a small gesture. So small it was almost imperceptible, but it was the first crack in the thick wall of her terror. It made no sense. Why would a man who had traded a valuable rifle for her show such a basic human courtesy? She was his possession, his esclava. The Spanish word echoed in her mind, a brand seared onto her soul. Slaves were not given water first. The other warriors, Chayton, Nakona, and Tahapka, largely ignored her. They spoke to each other in their flowing musical language, their voices rising and falling with the crackle of the campfire. They didn't treat her with malice. They treated her with a profound, almost complete indifference. It was as if she were a ghost, a specter they could see but chose not to acknowledge. Only Tveta's eyes would occasionally meet hers across the flames. His gaze was intense, searching, but still completely unreadable. It wasn't the leering look of a captor. It was something deeper, more complex, and it unnerved her far more than any open threat could have. Her first real test came on the third day. The sky, which had been a relentless, cloudless sheet of blue, turned a bruised, ugly purple-gray. The air grew heavy, still, and oppressive. Tveta barked a sharp command, and the warriors began moving with an urgent, practiced purpose, securing the horses and their supplies. Abigail, understanding nothing but the sudden spike in tension, simply stood there, useless and afraid. A fierce wind whipped through the canyon, carrying with it the first stinging drops of rain. Then a flash of lightning split the sky, followed by a crack of thunder so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Panic, raw and primal, seized her. She had a deep, childhood fear of thunderstorms, a relic of an incident where lightning had struck a tree just yards from her family's cabin in Missouri. She squeezed her eyes shut, a small, involuntary whimper escaping her lips. She felt like a helpless child again. Suddenly, a heavy weight settled over her shoulders. She gasped, her eyes flying open. It was Taveta. He had draped his own buffalo hide robe over her. The hide was warm from his body and smelled of smoke, leather, and the wild, clean scent of the plains. He stood directly in front of her, his body shielding her from the worst of the wind-driven rain. He said nothing. He simply held her gaze as the storm raged around them, the thunder booming like cannon fire. In that moment, her fear of the storm was completely eclipsed by a dizzying wave of confusion. This man, this savage, this warrior who had bought her like a sack of grain, was protecting her. He was offering her his own comfort, his own warmth, his own protection from the elements. The gesture was so completely contrary to everything she believed, everything she had been taught, that her mind struggled to process it. She could feel the warmth of the robe seeping into her chilled skin, a strange and forbidden comfort. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. Taveta took his robe back without a word and turned away to check on the horses, his movements economical and precise. Abigail stood there trembling, not from the cold, but from the violent turmoil within her. The lines were blurring. He was her captor, the symbol of her degradation and her greatest fear. Yet in his silent, deliberate actions, he was treating her with more consideration and respect than Silas Finch ever had in the 2 years she had known him. Their arrival at the main Comanche encampment a day later was the true beginning of her new life. Nestled in a wide, grassy valley, protected by high mesas, it was a sprawling village of dozens of teepees, their painted hides glowing in the afternoon sun. The air was filled with the sounds of life, children laughing, dogs barking, the rhythmic thud of women tanning hides. If she had been invisible to the warriors on the trail, she was now the absolute center of all attention. Faces peered from every teepee, dark eyes filled with a mixture of raw curiosity, deep suspicion, and, from some, open and undisguised hostility. Children pointed, women whispered behind their hands. She was a Tabe Bo, a white person, an enemy. The weight of their collective gaze was suffocating. She felt her otherness like a physical cloak, heavy and stifling. Taveta led his horse, and Abigail by extension, through the heart of the village. He didn't lead her to a slave's pen or a work area. He stopped before one of the largest teepees, one decorated with paintings of sons and successful buffalo hunts. An older woman emerged. Her face was like a beautiful wrinkled map, and her eyes held the wisdom of ages. This was Pia, Taveta's mother. Pia's gaze was sharp and appraising. She looked Abigail up and down, taking in her torn, filthy dress, her matted blonde hair, and the raw terror in her blue eyes. She spoke to her son, her tone sharp and questioning. Taveta answered in a low, firm voice. Abigail couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the argument. Pia's eyes kept flicking to Abigail, and they held no welcome. She clearly, fiercely did not approve of her son bringing a white woman into their camp, into their family's lodge. The argument ended when Taveta placed a hand gently on his mother's arm. He spoke one final, quiet sentence. Pia's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. She let out a long, weary sigh, and then gestured with a look of deep reluctance for Abigail to enter the teepee. The inside was a revelation. Far from the crude, dirty shelters she had imagined, it was a spacious, orderly home. Buffalo robes covered the floor, and woven backrests provided comfort. The air was cool and smoky from a small central fire pit. It was a home, and she was an intruder in it. That night, Pia tossed a simple deerskin dress at her feet and pointed to a secluded spot. The unspoken command was clear. Change out of the filthy rags of your past. The deerskin was soft and supple against Abigail's skin. It felt strange, foreign, yet it was also clean and practical. When she emerged, Pia grunted a sound that could have been approval or dismissal and handed her a bowl of stew. Abigail ate in silence, acutely aware of the two people watching her. Taveta sat across the fire, cleaning the mechanism of a pistol, his movements efficient and precise. Pia sat working a piece of leather with an awl. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken questions and simmering tensions. Later, when it was time to sleep, Pia pointed to a pile of robes on one side of the teepee. Tveta's sleeping robes were on the opposite side. A clear, unspoken boundary had been drawn. There was no suggestion of forced intimacy, no hint that he would claim the rights her purchase implied. He simply lay down on his own robes, wrapped himself in a blanket, and closed his eyes. Abigail lay awake for hours, her mind racing. She had been traded for a rifle. She was a captive, yet she was not in chains. She was not being beaten or starved. Her captor had shielded her from a storm and now slept on the other side of a fire from her, affording her a respect she could not possibly comprehend. He had promised her something with his eyes, with his actions, a language she was only just beginning to learn. The horror of her sale remained a raw, open wound. But for the very first time, a tiny, fragile seed of a new emotion began to sprout in the barren soil of her despair. It was confusion, utter, profound confusion. Who was this man, Tveta? And what in God's name did he truly want from her? The first few weeks in the Comanche camp were a crucible. Abigail, renamed Tichinab, one who stays by a still reluctant Pia, was plunged into a world where every rule she had ever known was obsolete. Her days were no longer measured by the chiming of a clock she didn't own, but by the movement of the sun and the rhythm of the camp's needs. Pia became her tutor, though a stern and demanding one. She communicated mostly through sharp gestures and exasperated sighs, but the lessons were clear. Abigail learned to scrape hides until her arms ached, to gather a dozen different kinds of roots and berries, to sew with a bone needle and sinew thread. Every task was a lesson in survival, a skill in a world that did not suffer fools or the weak. The work was hard, far harder than the drudgery on Silas's homestead. But it was different. This was work with a purpose. She could see the direct result of her labor in the food they ate, the clothes they wore, the very shelter that kept them warm. There was no kindness in Pia's instruction, but slowly, a grudging respect began to grow with each task Abigail mastered. The first time she successfully started a fire with a fire drill, Pia watched her with narrowed eyes and gave a single, curt nod. For Abigail, it felt like winning a medal. Tveta remained a distant, enigmatic presence. He was a war chief, a man of great importance in the band, and he was often gone for days at a time, leading hunting parties or patrols. When he was in the village, he was usually in council with the elders or training the young warriors. He rarely spoke to Abigail directly, yet his presence was a constant, unspoken force in her life. She would feel his eyes on her as she worked, a steady, watchful gaze that still made her hands tremble. He never offered to help with her woman's work, for that was not his place. But after a successful hunt, a brace of plump rabbits would silently appear near the teepee, a quiet contribution. But the animosity from others in the camp was a persistent, simmering threat. A warrior named So, bearded one, was particularly hostile. He had lost his family in a cavalry raid years before, and he saw in Abigail's blue eyes and pale hair the face of all his enemies. He would taunt her in the Numunu tongue, words she didn't fully understand but whose venomous tone was unmistakable. He would kick dust on the hides she was cleaning or deliberately spook the horse she was trying to water. He was a constant, low-level torment. One afternoon it escalated. Abigail was returning from the creek with two heavy water skins when Moxo blocked her path. He stood with two of his friends, his face twisted in a sneer. He said something sharp and insulting, and then he lunged, not at her, but at the water skins. He knocked them from her hands, and the precious water, which she had carried for half a mile under the hot sun, soaked uselessly into the thirsty ground. Tears of pure frustration and anger welled in Abigail's eyes. She had worked too hard for this. Without thinking, she spun on him, her voice choked with rage. "Leave me alone," she cried out in English. Moxo, surprised by her sudden defiance, just laughed. He took a menacing step closer, raising his hand as if to strike her. Before he could move another inch, a hand like a steel band clamped down hard on his shoulder. It was Tveta. He had appeared as if from nowhere, silent as a shadow. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes blazing with a cold fire that made Moxo visibly flinch. Tveta spoke, his voice dangerously low, almost a growl. It was a short, sharp sentence. Whatever he said, it was devastatingly effective. Moxo's bravado evaporated instantly. He stared at Taveta, his eyes wide with a fear that bordered on reverence. He mumbled an apology, his gaze fixed on the ground, and then he and his friends practically scrambled to get away. Taveta turned to Abigail. The fury in his eyes softened as he looked at her, replaced by that same unreadable, intense expression. He gestured to the empty water skins on the ground, then pointed back towards the creek. He turned and began to walk. The message was clear. We will get the water again. Abigail hesitated for only a second before grabbing the skins and following him. They walked in silence. When they reached the creek, Taveta took one of the heavy skins from her and filled it himself. As they walked back to the camp, he slowed his long strides to match her shorter ones. It was another small act, another confusing piece of the puzzle that was this man. He had not only defended her, he had humbled a fellow warrior to do so, and now he was sharing her burden. This incident marked a major turning point. The open hostility from the others didn't vanish entirely, but it became far more subdued. The word had spread with the speed of a prairie fire. The white woman was under Taveta's personal and absolute protection. To insult her was to insult him, and no one was foolish enough to do that twice. But that protection came at a price. Abigail was now inextricably linked to him in the eyes of the entire tribe. She was no longer just the captive. She was Taveta's white woman, and the whispers that followed her now were not just of hate, but of speculation. Why did the great war chief protect her so fiercely? He had taken no other wife. He showed no interest in the young Comanche women who watched him with admiring eyes. Why her? The answer to that question was a ghost from Taveta's own past, a story Abigail could not have known. Years before, when he was just a boy, his younger sister Topasana had been captured by white traders. They had found her body weeks later, left in a canyon. The trauma of that loss and the consuming guilt of not having been able to protect her had forged the man he was. In Abigail, in her fear and her vulnerability, he saw an echo of his lost sister. His determination to protect her wasn't born of love for a woman, not yet. It was born of a fierce, desperate need to atone for a past failure. His promise, "You will not be a slave," was a vow to his sister's memory as much as it was a promise to Abigail. This truth remained locked in his heart, a silent, driving force behind every action. All Abigail knew was the paradox of her situation. She was a captive who was fiercely protected, a slave who was granted respect, an outsider who was being slowly, inexorably woven into the fabric of the tribe through the actions of one powerful, silent man. One evening, a new arrival threw the camp into a state of rare excitement. A group of Comancheros, the shadowy New Mexican traders who operated between the worlds of the white man and the Comanche, rode in with mules laden with goods. They brought iron pots, tobacco, colorful blankets, and most importantly, whiskey. Their leader was a man named Joaquin Cortez, a suave, silver-tongued trader with a thin mustache and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He spoke fluent Numunu, Spanish, and English, and his easy charm was a dangerous mask for a ruthless soul. His gaze lingered on Abigail as she helped Pia prepare the evening meal. You could see the gears turning in his head. Later that night, as the whiskey flowed and the trading grew loud, Cortez approached Tveta's tipi. He was invited in, a courtesy extended to a trading partner. He sat by the fire, his eyes glinting with avarice as he looked at Abigail. "The war chief has a new prize," Cortez said in Spanish, a language Abigail had picked up enough of from the settlers to understand. "A fine-looking woman. Blonde hair is rare. Men in Santa Fe would pay a great price for such a novelty. 200 silver dollars, maybe more." Abigail felt a chill run down her spine. She was being appraised again, her value being calculated in cold, hard currency. Tveta did not look up from the arrow he was fletching. His hands remained perfectly steady. "She is not for sale," he said, his Spanish as crisp and clear as Cortez's. Cortez chuckled, a greasy, unpleasant sound. "Everything is for sale, my friend, for the right price. I have repeating rifles, more than you can carry, ammunition. I can make you the most powerful chief on the plains." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Just for the girl. Abigail held her breath. This was the ultimate test. Silas Finch had sold her for one rifle. Joaquin Cortez was offering a small arsenal, enough to give Teveda's band a massive military advantage. She watched Teveda's face, searching desperately for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of the same covetous greed she had seen in her father-in-law's eyes. Teveda slowly, deliberately, set down his arrow. He lifted his head and his dark eyes met Cortez's. The easy warmth of the host was gone from his face, replaced by a coldness that was more terrifying than any open rage. "You have eaten my food and sat by my fire," Teveda said, his voice low and deadly. "So I will allow you to leave this lodge with your life. But if you ever speak of her again, if you ever so much as look at her again, I will cut out your tongue and feed it to the dogs. Now get out." The threat was delivered with such chilling finality that even the air in the teepee seemed to grow cold. Joaquin Cortez, for all his bravado, went pale. He saw in Teveda's eyes not a man making a bargain, but a man defending something sacred. He scrambled to his feet, bowed awkwardly, and practically fled the teepee. Abigail let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. Her heart was pounding a frantic drum against her ribs. He had been offered wealth and power for her, and he had refused without a moment's hesitation. He had defended her not as property, but as something inviolable. Later, after Pia was asleep, Teveda looked across the fire at her. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken meaning. He finally spoke, his voice soft, almost gentle. He used the few English words he had begun to learn, piecing them together carefully. "You, not for sale." Then he added a Numunu word she had come to know, Nu-muru. It meant my people or my family. But the way he said it, the way he looked at her as he spoke, it felt like he meant something more. He meant mine, not as a possession, but as a person who belonged with him. That night, Abigail cried for the first time since she had been taken. They were not tears of terror or despair. They were tears of profound, heart-wrenching confusion. The chains she had imagined were nowhere to be found. Instead, she was being bound by something far more complex and powerful, a debt of protection, a threat of respect, and the dawning, terrifying possibility that the promise whispered on the day of her sale might not have been a lie after all. The fragile peace of the passing weeks was a balm on Abigail's soul. She was Titchy Knob now, a name that felt less like a label and more like a budding identity. The rhythms of the camp had become her own. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and capable. She could read the subtle language of the plains, the way a shift in the wind could foretell rain. Her relationship with Feda remained a landscape of vast, unspoken distances. He was the sun that warmed the valley, a presence felt even when unseen. He'd be gone for days on patrol, and when he returned, a quiet energy would settle over the teepee. In the evenings, she would watch him from across the central fire as he meticulously repaired his weapons, his large hands moving with a surprising, gentle precision. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, she would catch him watching her, his dark eyes filled with a brooding intensity that was neither threatening nor possessive, but something far more complex. The space between their sleeping robes remained sacrosanct, an invisible line of respect he never once crossed. This delicate world, built on unspoken understandings, was shattered by the thunder of a single horse. A rider from the Antelope Band came from the north, his face a mask of dust and dread. The horse under him was a testament to the urgency of his message, its sides heaving, foam and sweat turning its coat to a dark paste. The man, a warrior named Pahayoko, nearly fell from the saddle. "Rangers!" he gasped, the word a ragged croak. "The Long Knives are coming!" The news ripped through the camp like a prairie fire. The cheerful sounds of the afternoon vanished, replaced by an electric silence. Women froze, clutching their children. Teveda emerged from the council lodge, his expression hardening as he listened to Pahayoko's desperate report. This wasn't just a patrol. It was a company, more than 100 strong, armed with Colt revolvers and new carbines. And they were led by a man whose name was spoken like a plague, Captain Elias Thorne. Thorne, Pahayoko choked out, had just fallen upon a peaceful hunting camp of the Kiowa. It wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. Warriors, women, children, slaughtered without distinction, their bodies left for the vultures as a message. And their next destination, according to a scout who had barely escaped, was this very valley. A cold, sickening dread coiled in Abigail's stomach. These rangers were her people. But the name Elias Thorne conjured no image of heroism. It conjured only the vision of Silas Finch's greedy eyes, of men who saw others as obstacles or objects. She looked at Pia, standing beside her face carved from stone. She looked at the young boys, no older than 15, rushing to fetch their bows, their faces a volatile mixture of terror and a desperate need to prove their manhood. These were not the faceless savages from the stories she'd been told. They were a people, her people now, and Elias Thorne was coming to erase them. The War Council convened immediately. Abigail stood outside, straining to hear the passionate voices within. She heard an old chief plead for them to flee east, into the Badlands where the rangers' horses couldn't follow. Then she heard Tveda's voice. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the others with a calm, resonant authority. He would not run. To run was to invite pursuit, to allow Thorne to butcher them on open ground as he had the Kiowa. No, they would not run. They would fight. But they would fight on Numunu ground, by Numunu rules. He spoke of a place to the north, a narrow winding canyon of rock and shadow, a place the white men called Diablo's Maw. It was a natural fortress, a killing ground where a few could hold off many. When he emerged, his decision was written on his face. He moved with lethal purpose, directing the warriors. War paint was mixed, black for strength, red for blood. A low, solemn chant began to rise, a sound that vibrated deep in Abigail's chest. It was a song of courage, a prayer, a farewell to the living world. As the 50 chosen warriors prepared their horses, Tveda found her. She was frantically helping Pia pack supplies, her hands trembling so badly she could barely tie the knots. "Titchy knob," he said. She looked up at him. He was transformed. Stripped to his breechcloth, his chest and face were covered in the stark, terrifying patterns of war paint. He seemed taller, fiercer, a primal force. "You will go with Pia," he stated, his new English still clipped but precise. "And the others. Go south. Follow the Cimarron River to the Standing Stones. Do not stop. Wait for us there." "You are going to fight them," she breathed, the words catching in her throat. He gave a single sharp nod. "It is our way. We do not give our homes to monsters." A wave of desperation washed over her. The thought of him riding into that canyon, facing the rifles of 100 men, was a physical pain. "Don't go," she whispered, knowing how foolish and selfish the words were. "Please, just come with us." "To live as a rabbit, always running?" he asked, a flicker of sorrow in his eyes. "That is not life. That is a slow death. It is better to die as a wolf, defending its own." He looked at her, at the terror plain on her face, and his expression softened. "I must do this. To protect Pia. To protect the children." He paused, his gaze intensifying. "To protect you." Before she could process his words, before she could even breathe, he reached out. His large, calloused hand came up, and he gently, so gently, brushed a stray lock of blonde hair from her cheek. The touch was feather-light, a ghost of a caress, yet it sent a bolt of lightning through her entire being. The fearsome war chief had touched her with the tenderness one might use on a fragile flower. It was the most intimate gesture she had ever known. "I will return, Titchynob," he said, his voice a low vow. "I promise you." He held her gaze for one heartbeat longer, a universe of unspoken emotion passing between them. Then he turned, swung himself onto his stallion's back, and with a sharp cry, led his warriors out of the camp and toward Diablo's Maw. The exodus south was a grim, forced march. The air was filled with the sounds of weeping children and the constant, anxious whispers of the women. Every so often, the afternoon wind would carry the distant, rhythmic pop-pop-pop of gunfire. Each faint sound was a hammer blow to Abigail's heart. Pia, sensing her spiraling terror, put a steady hand on her arm. "Do not fill your heart with ghosts," the old woman said, her voice raspy but firm. "My son's spirit is strong. He was born in a storm. He will not be broken by a little wind." She looked Abigail in the eye. "He made you a promise. Tveta does not break his promises. 2 agonizing days later, they reached the standing stones. They made a cold, fireless camp, the mood bleak with dread. A scout was sent back north. The hours he was gone were the longest of Abigail's life. When he finally returned, his news was a double-edged sword. The battle was over. The Rangers were broken, retreating in disarray. Captain Thorne had been soundly defeated. A weak cheer went up, but the scout held up a hand, his face grim. The victory, he said, was bathed in blood. Many warriors would not be returning. Many more were badly wounded. The cheer died in the air. Abigail's eyes were fixed on the northern trail, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. The survivors began to trickle in, singly and in small, haggard groups. They were a portrait of battle's brutal cost, men limping, supported by their friends, their eyes holding a haunted, distant look. Abigail and Pia stood together, a silent, terrified vigil, scanning each new arrival. She saw Chayton, his left arm in a crude sling. She saw Nakona, a bloody gash across his thigh. But with each warrior that returned without Tveta, the knot of panic in Abigail's stomach twisted tighter. The sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of orange and blood. Hope dwindled with the fading light. Pia stood like a carved statue, but a single tear traced a path through the deep wrinkles on her cheek. The promise was broken. The wolf had fallen. Then on the highest point of the ridge, silhouetted against the dying sun, 2 horses appeared. One was Tveta's magnificent stallion. Slumped over its neck, held in place by the warrior leading the horse, was Tveta. "He's alive!" The cry tore from Abigail's throat. She ran, stumbling over rocks and brush, her only thought to get to him. They laid him gently upon his robes inside the teepee. He was unconscious, his face a ghastly ashen gray. A thick, hastily applied bandage around his ribs was soaked through with dark arterial blood. A ranger's bullet had torn through his side. Pia became a figure of focused intensity, barking orders for herbs and moss to pack the wound. With steady hands, she cut away the bandage and began to clean the ragged, ugly hole. Abigail stood by, paralyzed by a crushing sense of helplessness. She was an outsider once more, a useless observer in this fight for his life. The fever set in by midnight. It came on him like a predator, shaking his strong body with violent tremors. He began to thrash in a tormented delirium, crying out in Numunu, reliving the battle, his hands clenching at unseen enemies. Then he cried out a name that sent a chill through Abigail. "Topasana!" he choked out, his voice filled with an anguish so profound it was terrifying. "Topasana, I am sorry." Pia, who had been so stoic, flinched as if struck. Her iron control finally shattered. Sobs racked her ancient frame as she tried to soothe him, her tears falling onto his feverish skin. Watching her grief, watching the life flicker in the man who had saved her, something inside Abigail broke. The helplessness transformed into a fierce, unyielding resolve. She knelt on the other side of his robes, gently taking the damp cloth from Pia's trembling hands. "Let me," she whispered. "Rest. I will watch him." Pia looked up, her dark eyes swimming with tears. She saw not a white captive, but another woman desperate to save the man they both cherished. She gave a slow, exhausted nod. For 3 days and 3 nights, Abigail did not leave his side. The tepee became her entire world. She learned to clean the angry, weeping wound. She learned to force spoonfuls of broth and bitter medicinal tea past his clenched teeth. She bathed his burning skin, and in the long, silent hours of the night, she talked to him in a low, constant murmur. She told him of the green hills of Missouri, of catching fireflies in a jar, of the smell of her mother's baking bread. She poured out the memories of her old life, offering them like a lifeline to pull him back from the shadowy world where he wandered. In that intimate, desperate vigil, as she fought for every breath he took, the last of her confusion burned away in the fire of his fever. The gratitude, the respect, the fear she had for him, she finally recognized it for what it was. It was love, a fierce, terrifying, and absolute love for the man her people would call an enemy. She loved him for the honor he showed, for the protection he gave, for the silent promise he kept, even now. The man who had bought her for a rifle had claimed her soul, not by force, but by a quiet nobility she had never known existed. On the fourth morning, the air in the teepee felt different. Cool. Still. The fever had broken. Abigail, slumped against a backrest, was startled awake by a subtle shift. Teveda's thrashing had ceased. His breathing was deep and even. His eyes fluttered open. The delirium was gone. They were clear, lucid, and they were fixed on her. His gaze moved from her weary face down to his bandaged side, then back to her. A flicker of understanding crossed his features. His hand, weak but steady, moved across the buffalo robe and came to rest over hers. "Titchy Knob," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He used her Comanche name, the one that meant one who stays. And in the way he said it, in the deep, unwavering look in his eyes, she knew. She had stayed, and she was home. But the frontier is a relentless beast, and peace is a fragile, fleeting thing. A man like Captain Thorne does not accept defeat. He nurses his wounds, and he plots his revenge. And the shadow of the past, both his and hers, is long and dark. The love that was forged in fire and blood was about to face a trial they could not yet even imagine. If you were captivated by the story of Abigail and Teveda, please show your support. Hit that like button, let me know your favorite part in the comments, and be sure to share this video with anyone who loves a powerful story of the Old West. Most importantly, subscribe and ring that notification bell because the story is far from over. You won't want to miss what happens when Abigail decides she needs to go back and face the man who sold her. Thank you for listening.